She was just a quiet figure moving through the edges of a city that never slowed down. A black woman with a nurse's uniform, a paper bag of food in one hand, and no interest in being seen. No headlines, no cameras, just Thursdays and a bench no one cared about, where a nameless man waited without expectation. But what began as a simple act of kindness would ignite a chain of events that would shake corridors of power, drag ghosts from beneath classified silence, and summon a dozen uniformed warriors to stand where no one thought they'd appear. Her name would cross military channels, whisper through encrypted networks, and land in the halls of Congress, not because she asked for recognition, but because her grace made forgetting impossible. If you're ready to find out how a forgotten corner of the city became the stage for a reckoning decades in the making, hit like, subscribe, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from and what you think is really going on, because nothing in this story is what it seems. Danielle Moore lived in a rhythm that didn't make headlines. She didn't need to. Her life unfolded in soft steps and meaningful silences, the kind of days you'd miss if you weren't paying attention. 34 years old, born and raised in the heart of Atlanta, she'd grown into her purpose without ever shouting it aloud. A hospice nurse at Grady Medical, she spent her days ushering strangers from this life to whatever came next. There was a kind of nobility in that, a quiet honor she never advertised. Her co-workers respected her. Her patients trusted her. But outside those walls, Danielle walked alone. She didn't complain. She didn't expect applause. Every Thursday evening, as the city peeled back its business day rush and slipped into the static hum of nighttime traffic, Danielle walked 2 blocks, farther than necessary. Past the tired bus bench with a crooked ad for injury lawyers, past the liquor store with neon that buzzed more than it glowed, past the old corner lot where kids used to play before it filled with broken glass and discarded takeout wrappers. She wasn't heading home. Not yet. She was heading to a spot near the old veterans shelter, just down from the crumbling red brick wall tagged with layers of old graffiti. That's where Joe sat. No last name, no origin story, just Joe. He looked like the kind of man who'd seen more than he said and carried all of it in the slump of his shoulders. Wrapped in a military green coat that had outlived at least 2 winters, he sat hunched on a worn milk crate beside a rusted shopping cart covered in a stained camouflage tarp. Most people passed him without a glance. But every Thursday, Danielle stopped. She never asked questions, never pried. She simply handed him a warm meal packed in foil-wrapped containers. Fried chicken and collards, red beans and rice, mac and cheese when she had the time to do it right. Always homemade, always hot. And Joe? He always stood to take it, always nodded, deep, slow, with the kind of respect that didn't need words. He never asked for money, never complained. Sometimes he'd mutter a thank you, but usually it was just the nod. That was their ritual. That was enough. Danielle had been doing this for over a year. No one had told her to. No program, no outreach ministry, no social media campaign. It was just what you did when someone needed you, and the world wasn't paying attention. She remembered once asking him if he needed a coat, and he just looked down at the one he had, said, "It's not the cold that bothers me. It's the forgetting." She'd never asked again. That night, she made extra soup. Chicken, slow-cooked, seasoned the way her grandmother used to do it, garlic, onion, thyme, a splash of vinegar at the end. She packed it with cornbread and a bottle of water and made the walk after her shift. Her nurse's bag hung from her shoulder, and her tired legs ached from a 12-hour day, but she didn't waver. Joe was there. Same spot, same posture, but something about the way he looked at her as she approached made her pause. His duffel, usually tossed beside him, was sitting upright, zipped, with the straps crossed neatly over the top. When he saw her, he rose, not just stood, but rose, like a man remembering how. She handed him the food. He took it slowly, fingers trembling just slightly as he accepted the container. Then he looked at her, not past her, not through her, but into her. And he said something. Words, clear and purposeful. "You feed more than me." Danielle blinked, surprised. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice quiet. "You bring more than food," he said, gesturing toward his heart. "You bring something the war couldn't kill." the memory of kindness. She felt something heavy settle in her chest. She nodded slowly. "I just didn't want you to be hungry." Joe gave her a long look, then said, "Some debts don't stay unpaid forever." She wanted to ask what that meant, but the words felt too fragile, like stepping on a moment that wasn't hers to break. She smiled softly instead and said, "I'll see you next week." As she turned, she felt the air shift behind her, an almost imperceptible sensation, like eyes watching, unseen footsteps retreating. But when she glanced back, Joe was sitting again, head bowed, hands clasped around the warm container. That night, back in her apartment, Danielle curled beneath a quilt passed down from her grandmother and tried to forget the strange finality in his voice. The next morning, at work, a small envelope appeared on her desk at the nurse's station. No posti. No handwriting, but her name, scrawled in precise print. She opened it slowly. Inside was a single card, heavy stock, embossed with a symbol she didn't recognize. Below it a message, "Echo foresees you. Keep doing what you do." Her skin prickled. There was no name, no contact, no explanation. Patrice, her co-worker, glanced over. Secret admirer? Danielle quickly folded the card and smiled. Probably just someone from church. But she knew better. That weekend, during her usual grocery run, she bumped into Deacon Jenkins from her church. The older man was nearly giddy. "Can you believe it?" he said. "We hit the food drive goal. $5,000, just like that." "That's amazing," she said sincerely. "Even more amazing," he added, "it came in your name. Anonymous donor. Said you'd inspired them." Danielle felt her heart skip. "Me," said, "you serve without asking." So they wanted to match that energy. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. That night, her phone rang. Blocked number. A voice on the other end, female, calm, steady, said only, "He's not forgotten. Because of you." Click. Danielle stared at her phone, the dial tone filling the room like static. She didn't sleep much. The next Thursday, she made her usual meal. Catfish, hush puppies, mustard greens. The weather had turned crisp again. She walked the familiar path, but Joe wasn't there. The inscription, Fidelis Silentium, echoed in her thoughts more than once since that strange evening, the same way Joe's words, "Some debts don't stay unpaid forever," looped in the back of her mind like a whisper with weight. At work, she carried herself as usual, focused and precise, caring for patients with her signature grace and calm, but inside her spirit stirred. Her instincts were sharpened by years of comforting the dying, and she'd learned that the things left unsaid often meant more than what was spoken aloud. And now, Joe's silence felt too deliberate, too final to ignore. The mystery of Joe's disappearance, the anonymous card, and the church donation in her name weren't just coincidences anymore. They were a trail that had just begun. Danielle's suspicion, deep in the morning, she received a phone call from the front desk receptionist. "Danny, there's someone here to see you. No appointment. Says it's personal." That was unusual. She didn't receive visitors at work. Not ever. She made her way to the lobby, her steps cautious but composed. Waiting near the vending machines stood a tall man in a dark blue windbreaker, cropped hair, and a quiet demeanor that reminded her of the men who came home from war but never truly returned. He didn't introduce himself by name. He simply handed her a small envelope and said, "He wanted you to have this. That's all." She took it slowly, her fingers brushing against his rough, calloused hands. Before she could ask anything else, he turned and walked away without a word. She opened the envelope right there. Inside was a folded map of the city with a red circle marked at the edge of a neighborhood she'd never visited. On the back of the map were 5 words scribbled in black ink. He remembered. We remember too. That night, she drove to the marked location, an abandoned firehouse with boarded windows and a faded sign that once read Station 11. The air around it was heavy, the kind of stillness that carried stories in its silence. She didn't go inside. She didn't have to. Parked just across the street was a black SUV with tinted windows. It didn't drive away when she approached. It just idled, watching. She stood there for a moment, staring back, before returning to her car. The message was clear. They saw her. She wasn't alone. The next morning, a quiet alert on her phone pinged. An anonymous donation had been made in her name to the hospital's Veterans Program. $10,000. No contact information, just a line in the message section. For the woman who kept Echo's fire burning. The name Echo triggered her memory. Echo 4, the name stitched into Joe's duffel. It was real. But a quick online search yielded nothing. No records, no units, no operations. Just vague references to discontinued recon units and classified deployments. She tried accessing military archives and veteran registries, but was met with restricted access and dead-end trails. Even Marcus, her fiancé, a high school history teacher with a knack for research, couldn't find anything official. That night, she couldn't sleep. The photo of Joe and the 5 soldiers haunted her thoughts. She sat at her kitchen table and studied their faces again. One of the men, taller than the rest, standing slightly behind the group, looked familiar. Not from real life, but from the blurred edge of a news story she once saw about a missing recon team presumed dead in a foreign conflict over a decade ago. The connection was thin, but it sparked a new question. What if Joe wasn't just homeless? What if he was someone buried beneath paperwork, someone the system had quietly erased, and she had accidentally brought him back into the light? The next day at work, one of the hospital's part-time staff, a retired Army nurse named Gloria, stopped Danielle in the break room and said, "Saw you got another bouquet at the front desk. No card though, just this." She handed Danielle a small tag from the arrangement. It had no name, only coordinates. Confused but curious, Danielle looked them up. The location pointed to a cemetery outside the city, in a small town she hadn't visited since she was a child. On Sunday, she drove out alone, letting her instincts guide her. The cemetery was quiet, surrounded by trees, the headstones weathered and covered in moss. She walked until she found the plot matching the coordinates. It wasn't a grave, it was a memorial plaque bearing 6 names. 5 matched the photo she had. The 6th was scratched off. Literally scratched off, as though someone had taken a knife to the bronze plate. A folded note had been left beneath a rock on the plaque. It read, "He made it out. We didn't. You fed his soul, not just his body." Danielle stood there, wind brushing against her cheeks, the sun casting long shadows across the ground. Something deep within her stirred. She had not stumbled into coincidence. She had been part of something. Something hidden, something unfinished, something sacred. Over the following week, small things continued happening. The engine light in her car turned off on its own after weeks of being on. A neighbor told her someone dropped off a new water heater while she was at work, paid in full, installation included. The return address simply said Echo. Every kindness she had given out of habit now came back in form she couldn't explain. And yet, none of it felt transactional. It felt reverent. Not as if someone was repaying a favor, but honoring a vow. A debt once owed not to her, but through her. Patrice, ever curious, asked why Danielle seemed a little different lately. Still, she kept moving, her routine unbroken, her Thursdays untouched. It was in that stillness that she noticed the next shift. It came on a Monday. Rain slicked the city in gray, and traffic hissed across streets like a warning. Danielle arrived at the hospice center with her usual thermos of coffee, her badge clipped to her coat, her hair wrapped in a tight bun. On the reception desk sat a white envelope, plain, unmarked, but unmistakably left for her. Inside was no letter this time, only a photo. Not of Joe, not of the recon team, but of her. It had been taken from across the street, blurry but unmistakable, her kneeling down as she placed a meal on the ground where Joe once sat. On the back, someone had written, "We are still watching. We are still grateful." That same day, Danielle was pulled aside by an administrator at the hospice. A donor had called anonymously and paid for 3 months' worth of medical supplies. When asked what prompted the generosity, the donor responded with only 2 words, "Danielle's route." The administrator, amused but slightly confused, congratulated her on apparently earning the attention of a mystery benefactor. Danielle smiled, but her mind raced. That phrase, Danielle's route, was not random. It was personal, specific. and whoever used it knew more than they should. That night, Malcolm, her fiancé, returned home from school and found her seated at the kitchen table, sorting through every piece of evidence she had: photos, notes, the coin, the card from the unknown man in the blue windbreaker. "Are you okay?" he asked, setting down his briefcase. "Something's happening," she said without looking up. "Something that started a long time ago. I just stepped into it." He listened, patient and steady, as she explained it all. Malcolm was her balance, the one who understood when to speak and when to let silence answer for itself. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Whatever this is," he said, "you're not facing it alone." 2 days later, Danielle's church pastor pulled her aside after service. He seemed cautious, even nervous. "I got a call," he said, his voice low, "from a woman. Said she was calling on behalf of someone named Echo. She asked me to tell you, your light doesn't just shine, it guides." Then she hung up. Danielle felt her breath leave her body slowly, like air being released from a sealed room. The pattern was getting clearer. Whoever these people were, they weren't trying to scare her. They were affirming her, elevating her, honoring something in her that they had witnessed. But it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about Joe, the man everyone overlooked, the man who had apparently never stopped being part of something much larger. That week, she drove back to the same cemetery she had visited before. It was early morning, and the fog still clung low to the grass. At the same memorial stone, she noticed something new: a small bronze plate affixed to the ground near the scratched-off name. It read, "Danielle's Vigil." Below that, another line, "In memory of those remembered in silence." Her throat tightened. She hadn't asked for recognition. She had never wanted it. But this was not about fame or reward. It was about legacy. She knelt, said a quiet prayer, and whispered, "Thank you for not letting him disappear." That same afternoon, her phone rang while she was shopping for groceries. The caller ID was blocked, as always. She answered, expecting another message, another whisper from the unknown. But this time, the voice was different. It was male, gravelly and tired. "He kept your containers," the voice said. Danielle froze in the produce aisle, one hand still hovering over a bunch of bananas. "What?" "Every single one. Washed them, stacked them, kept them clean. Said it was his way of honoring the one good thing he still had." Then the line went dead. That night, she sat with Malcolm and told him about the call. "He saw you as his mission," Malcolm said quietly. "Not someone to save him, someone to remind him he was still human." The next morning, Danielle returned to work to find that her usual parking space had been coned off. A staff member handed her a note taped to a key. It read, "Upgraded. Your route matters." In the parking spot stood a gently used hybrid car, same color as her old one, same make, just newer. No paperwork, no explanation. She tried to refuse, but the hospice administrator told her it had been arranged through official donation channels, legally processed and final. The donor's name was simply listed as E4G. She didn't need to guess what it meant. Echo 4 Group. It was real. It had power. And it wasn't finished. That Thursday, despite the lingering drizzle, she packed a meal again. Fried catfish, mustard greens, and a square of cornbread just the way Joe had liked it. She walked her old path, felt the memories rise with each footstep, and placed the food down in the same spot. No one appeared. No one watched visibly. But she left it anyway. As she turned to go, she saw something etched into the sidewalk, fresh and unmistakable. "Keep walking." He would have. That message was for her. The next day, the clinic received a shipment of brand new medical beds. Top-tier models. Danielle found out from the shipping company that the order had been placed by a firm that specialized in government contracts. When she called the listed number, it rang once and disconnected. By now, the pattern was undeniable. These were not isolated gestures. They were coordinated acknowledgments, planned moves by a group or network with reach, with purpose, and with a deep connection to Joe. At night, she would dream of military boots moving silently down empty streets, and wake with a deep understanding that everything happening now was part of something layered and immense. Still, nothing prepared her for the day Joe returned. Not in flesh, but in trace. It was a Thursday. Danielle, carrying a fresh meal of stewed oxtails and rice with collard greens, walked her regular route, unsure if she still believed he would appear. His absence had stretched into weeks now, yet she carried on as if he'd never left, as if the empty sidewalk still deserved the ritual. But this time was different. At the familiar corner, someone else waited. Not a homeless man, not a veteran, but a boy. No older than 17, lean with wide shoulders and clean clothes. He stood by the brick wall and watched her approach like he had rehearsed this moment. "You're her," he said without preamble. Danielle blinked. "Excuse me." "Danielle, you're her." His voice trembled slightly, as if carrying weight far beyond his age. "He told us about you." She froze in place. "Who are you?" "My brother was one of the 6, he said. "He didn't make it. But Joe made it out. He came back for us. For me." Danielle's breath hitched. "You're Echo," she whispered, less a question than a realization. The boy nodded. "The rest of them are scattered. Some gone, some hiding. But he found a way to reach all of us. Through you." He handed her a sealed envelope, nodded once, and walked away before she could say another word. Inside the envelope was a small laminated badge, an ID from the Department of Veterans Affairs. Joseph Rankin, blood type O+. Last listed assignment, Echo 4 Recon. Status, missing. Danielle sank onto the sidewalk where Joe once sat and stared at the ID card. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. But her heart hammered in her chest like a warning bell. The next day, when she arrived at work, the hospice center had an unusual visitor, a woman in a tailored black suit, clipboard in hand, whose name tag read simply M. Reed, Federal Liaison. She asked to speak privately. In the break room, with blinds drawn, she offered Danielle a piece of paper with her name on it. "Your name came up in a closed inquiry," she explained. "You cared for a man named Joseph Rankin." Danielle nodded cautiously. "He was a friend." "He was more than that," Reed said, her tone sharp but respectful. "He was a loose end. One we thought was lost permanently. Your actions brought him back into the field of view. You should know that comes with implications." Danielle didn't flinch. "I didn't do anything but feed him. That's not a crime." "It's not," Reed agreed. "But it is noted, it's seen, and it's honored." She stood, nodded once, and left. No more questions. No more warnings. But the next morning, Danielle found the exterior security cameras of the hospice had been upgraded, new, high-resolution models, professionally installed. The front desk receptionist said it was part of a citywide pilot program. Danielle knew better. Someone was ensuring she was protected. Not observed, protected. That weekend, Malcolm woke to find her sitting on the floor, surrounded by open boxes of her old journals. "I need to remember," she said when he asked what she was doing. "I need to retrace this from the beginning." She read through every entry she had written since she first met Joe. Notes about what meals she had brought, what little things he'd said or done, the days he didn't show up. Patterns emerged. The days he looked exhausted aligned with certain national news reports about covert missions. The day he asked for a coat had coincided with the anniversary of a deadly Middle East ambush she remembered seeing in passing headlines. She started to suspect that Joe had never truly been off the grid. He had been circling it. The next piece of the puzzle came in the form of a folded map tucked between pages of one of her journals. It wasn't hers. She hadn't put it there. It was hand-drawn, labeled with crude but clear markings. Buildings, alleyways, and paths around her neighborhood. Some were circled, some crossed out. In the corner, one word was scrawled: safe. She took it to a retired veteran named Elijah, one of her hospice patients who had served as an intelligence officer. He looked it over and said, "That's a surveillance pattern. Someone was protecting you, watching for blind spots, anticipating movement." Danielle's hands trembled slightly. Who? Elijah squinted at the markings. Someone trained. Someone who hadn't forgotten how to do his job. That night, she returned to the old veterans shelter. It was still boarded up, but now the boards were clean, the area swept. On the bench nearby, where she once left food, sat a sealed box. Her name was carved into the lid. Inside was a stack of carefully cleaned meal containers, hers. The ones she had given to Joe over the past year, each one labeled with the date and the meal inside. The precision took her breath away. Beneath the containers lay a folder. Inside, a dossier of photographs, receipts, and notes, all documenting her acts of kindness. Photos of her giving food, copies of her donation receipts to the church, even a thank you letter from a veteran's mother she barely remembered helping. At the bottom of the folder, one line written in Joe's handwriting said, "The world watches cruelty. We watched your grace." Danielle clutched the folder to her chest and sat on the bench until the streetlights buzzed on. The next morning, another anonymous donation hit the hospice center, a new wing built in honor of fallen veterans. When the ribbon cutting was held, Danielle's name was listed on the plaque as founding compassion donor, though she hadn't given $1. Yet these things arrived precise and thoughtful, like coded signals from hands trained to serve. Danielle had become something between a legend and a witness to something larger than herself. And even though no one had said it outright, she knew her life was being protected and her actions cataloged with reverence. What surprised her most was that she didn't feel overwhelmed by it. She felt affirmed, even strengthened. It wasn't surveillance born of control, but guardianship earned through grace. Still, it raised questions she couldn't stop asking. Who were the watchers? What remained of Echo for? And most importantly, why had Joe chosen her of all people to be the one to carry the story forward? One day, as she walked out of the hospice after her shift, she noticed something unusual. The vending machine by the rear parking lot, a neglected fixture no one ever used, now displayed fresh stock and gleaming buttons. Not only was it working, but it had also been stocked with her favorite snacks, some of which had been discontinued years ago. Curious, she inserted $1, pressed the code for a bag of chips she hadn't tasted since college, and out came not just a snack, but a folded piece of paper. She glanced around. No one seemed to be watching. She unfolded the note. "We remember your father. His kindness lived in your hands before it ever reached ours. He served with someone who remembered Echo. You completed what he began." Her legs nearly gave beneath her. Her father, who had died when she was 12, had served in the military, but she had never been told specifics. Her mother had always remained vague, saying only that he had been involved in sensitive missions. Danielle never pressed further. She had mourned, honored him quietly, and moved forward. Now, someone had just bridged her past with her present in one sentence. She hurried home and pulled out the small box of her father's belongings her mother had left her. Inside were letters, dog tags, and a photo she barely remembered seeing. This time, looking more closely, she noticed something new. A patch on the sleeve of one of his squad members in the background, barely visible, matched the Echo for insignia she had seen on Joe's duffel. Her hands shook. Her father hadn't just served. He had crossed paths with Joe's world long before she ever knew him. Suddenly, her involvement wasn't just kindness. It was continuation. The next morning, she walked into work and found a man in the waiting area, his posture rigid, his haircut military short, his gaze sharp. He stood as she entered and extended a hand. "Ma'am," he said. "Name's Halston. We knew Joe. We watched over him after the war, made sure he never fell completely out of reach. But he trusted few people. You were one of them." Danielle shook his hand. "I didn't do anything special." Halston shook his head. "You gave him something the VA, the medals, the bureaucrats never did. Dignity. You didn't treat him like a problem. You treated him like a person. That changes more than you know." He reached into his coat and handed her a key. "Locker 38, Northeast Storage Depot. He wanted you to have what's inside. He said it's safer with you." Then he walked out. Danielle didn't chase him. There was no point. He had delivered his message and vanished as efficiently as he had appeared. That evening, she drove across town to the storage facility. The clerk looked surprised when she gave the key and name. "It's been rented for years, paid in full." Nobody's been here in almost a decade. He led her to locker 38. Inside was a large metal footlocker, aged but well kept. She opened it slowly, unsure what she would find. Inside were dozens of carefully preserved notebooks, maps, military files, photographs, and audio tapes labeled with dates and places, some of which matched the names from the memorial site. She realized then that Joe hadn't just kept memories. He had archived everything. Missions, names, accounts of what happened, and what had been covered up. Echo for hadn't been erased. It had been hidden deliberately. Joe had preserved it all, waiting for someone who would protect it, not exploit it. Danielle spent the next few days combing through the materials. She made digital copies, locked the originals in her home safe, and sent a copy to an encrypted drive whose address she stored off-site. Among the materials was one file that stood out. It was a letter, handwritten by Joe. It wasn't addressed to any agency, soldier, or brother-in-arms. It was addressed to her. Danielle, it read, "If you're reading this, it means you followed the path farther than I ever could. I wasn't just broken. I was waiting for someone who would see past the cracks and into the story we left buried. Echo was more than a unit. We were a promise, one that got lost in the silence. But you remembered. You held the thread. And because of you, the silence speaks again." By the time she finished reading, tears lined her cheeks. Not from sadness, from the kind of overwhelming recognition that only comes when someone tells you you've been seen deeply and without condition. From that day forward, Danielle knew her role had shifted. She was no longer just the nurse who brought food. She was now the keeper of Echo's truth, the living memory of men whose names had been lost in classified files and abandoned grave markers. She didn't ask for this responsibility, but she embraced it. Danielle and Malcolm had chosen a simple ceremony, small by design, with a modest guest list and a garden venue just outside Atlanta. Neither of them wanted extravagance. They wanted meaning. Yet, as the arrangements began to take form, Danielle noticed something subtle but unmistakable. Her plans were being altered from the edges. Vendors she hadn't contacted began reaching out to confirm bookings she never made. An elite catering company called to confirm a menu for a reception she hadn't upgraded. When she pressed the vendor, the representative said, "It's been taken care of. Your patron signed everything." Code name Echo sponsor. The phrase stopped her in her tracks. That night, she opened her wedding planning binder and began cross-referencing contacts, emails, and invoices. Each of the key service providers, the florist, the DJ, the venue, had been upgraded or paid in full by an anonymous benefactor. Every confirmation included some variation of a phrase to honor the woman who remembered Echo. She shared the details with Malcolm, who listened with a mix of awe and quiet concern. "You think this is safe?" he asked. "This isn't just generosity. This feels like something bigger." Danielle nodded. "It is bigger, but it's also real. They've never hurt me. They've only protected me. This is how they say thank you." Days later, a woman approached Danielle after church, dressed in Sunday white, her hands calloused from work. "You don't know me," she said, "but my husband served in Echo 4. I only learned the truth after he passed. He never talked about the missions, never spoke of the names. But one day, he told me if I ever heard the name Danielle Moore, I should do two things: pray for her and make sure her wedding day shines." She handed Danielle a sealed card and walked away before she could respond. Inside the card was a note. "You gave a man peace before he passed. You reminded him what grace feels like. This is our return." As the wedding date neared, more surprises followed. The bridal gown boutique called to inform Danielle that her original dress had been replaced with a custom piece designed by a renowned seamstress. The fitting had already been scheduled. When she arrived, the seamstress greeted her with a gentle smile and said, "I owed Joe a favor. He asked for this before he disappeared." The dress was perfect, simple, elegant, detailed with thread patterns shaped like olive branches and feathers, symbols of peace and remembrance. Each element carried a weight she couldn't explain, but she wore it with pride. Even her mother, typically skeptical of anything outside conventional logic, began to soften. "I don't know what you've done, baby," she said one evening, "but I hope you understand how deeply you're loved." Seen like this, it's rare. Danielle nodded, but didn't speak. Words couldn't encapsulate what she carried anymore. A week before the wedding, a package arrived without a return label. Inside was a small black box containing a folded American flag, meticulously preserved. Beneath it, a photograph of Joe in uniform stood beside Danielle's father, both smiling, both younger than she'd ever seen them. On the back of the photo was a short message: "Your father saved my life. You reminded me why it mattered." Danielle clutched the flag to her chest, unable to hold back the tears that came. This was no longer just about memory. It was legacy. It was continuity. And it was now stepping into the light with her, into the most sacred moment of her life. As the final week ticked down, a local youth orchestra contacted her to offer live music for the ceremony. When she explained she couldn't afford them, they said a grant had been issued in her name. The orchestra leader said, "Your name opened doors we didn't even knock on. Someone's pulling strings way above our heads." But it's all good strings. On the eve of the wedding, Danielle stood in the garden where the ceremony would be held, surrounded by candlelit lanterns, the scent of fresh lilacs drifting through the air. She looked out over the chairs, the altar, the soft golden lights, and realized how much of this had been shaped by unseen hands. But there was no fear in that realization, only reverence, only gratitude. That night, as she prepared her vows, a final note arrived, slipped under her hotel room door. It was typed, signed only with the initials JR. It read, "You have been our last link. Tomorrow, we honor not just your union, but the mission completed through your kindness. You kept the code alive without knowing the code. We salute you, and we will be there." Danielle folded the letter carefully, held it close to her heart, and whispered, "Thank you, Joe." The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, the air warm with promise, the garden filled with friends and family, flowers blooming with understated grace, music drifting across the rows like a blessing. Danielle, in her custom dress, stood at the threshold of the aisle, her heart steady, her eyes locked forward. The ceremony was ready to begin, but as she prepared to take her first step, a sound rose through the air, measured, synchronized, unmistakable. 12 pairs of boots. Danielle turned her head slightly and saw them. Marching in formation, 12 U.S. Marines in full dress uniform moved into the garden silently, splitting into two lines as they flanked the aisle. Guests gasped. Photographers froze. And in the center of them all, stepping forward with slow precision, was the commanding officer. He saluted her. Not the crowd. Not the groom. Her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice clear, resolute, filled with something sacred. 12 salutes for Danielle. Mission complete. She stood stunned, one hand over her mouth, tears brimming in her eyes. The words echoed around her, the ceremony forgotten for a moment, as everyone in attendance bore witness to a tribute deeper than tradition. Malcolm stepped beside her, took her hand gently, and whispered, "You did this. You carried them here." She nodded, voice too caught in emotion to speak. She now understood that her acts of kindness had not only reignited the legacy of Echo 4, but had also summoned the attention of something larger, deeper, and still very much alive. She was no longer just the nurse with a generous heart. She had become a living emblem of remembrance, a keeper of a story that once risked being buried by history. The afterglow of the wedding lingered for days. Articles circulated online about the mystery of the Marines at a local nurse's wedding, accompanied by blurry photos and speculation. Some wondered whether it was a government tribute, others guessed a military family surprise, but no one could trace the appearance to an official record. Every journalist who tried to verify their identity found no names, no permissions, and no base affiliations. Danielle watched the coverage silently, never commenting, never explaining, allowing the story to remain what it was meant to be, a mystery wrapped in reverence. As she returned to work, the hospice seemed to move more gently around her. Co-workers glanced at her with quiet curiosity, as if trying to reconcile the woman they'd known with the woman they now suspected had been touched by something uncommon. But Danielle didn't let it distract her. She resumed her shifts, checked vitals, calmed restless souls, and listened to confessions in whispered voices. One afternoon, while adjusting the morphine drip for a terminal patient, she heard the patient's son whisper, "She's the one they wrote about." The patient, weak but lucid, smiled and said, "It makes sense. I knew I recognized the grace." Danielle pretended not to hear, but inside, she knew that the story had begun to move beyond her reach. It was no longer hers to protect. It was becoming part of something collective. And then, the first signal arrived. Late one night, while folding laundry in her living room, Danielle's phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number. It contained no words, only coordinates. She paused, heart thrumming, and typed them into her laptop. The location pointed to a remote veterans cemetery 2 states away, long abandoned, no longer funded by the Department of Defense, marked as inactive. She hesitated. The trip would require planning, time off work, and answers she wasn't sure she was ready to face. But by morning, she had already packed a bag. Malcolm offered to drive. "Wherever this is leading you," he said, "I'm going too." They arrived at the cemetery just before dusk. The grounds were overgrown, the gates rusted, and most of the headstones faded beyond recognition. But near the center, one marker stood untouched, cleaned recently, the grass trimmed neatly around it. On the stone were no names, only a number, 041976E. Beside the marker, a folded piece of paper had been secured under a small rock. Danielle picked it up and read the words, "The storm returns. Be ready." He knew it would. Beneath the message was a drawing. Joe's handwriting again, unmistakable. It was a diagram, hand-sketched, showing 3 rings with her name at the center. Around the outer ring were markings that looked like unit symbols. She didn't recognize them, but she knew someone who might. Elijah, the retired intelligence officer under her hospice care, looked at the sketch later that week and frowned. "These aren't unit symbols," he said. "They're markers for activity hubs, operational centers. This one," he pointed to a triangle etched with a line through it, "that's a signal node. It means communication has been re-established." Danielle stared at the paper. "With who?" Elijah exhaled slowly. "With people we thought were gone." Days passed, and more messages came. Not all were direct. A billboard on her drive to work changed overnight, its usual insurance advertisement replaced by a quote, "You were not the light, but you lit the path." A bakery near her apartment began offering a new pastry named after her. An online veterans forum posted a tribute titled, "The Nurse Who Awoke the Sleeping Watch." Danielle understood the pattern. The silence was ending. But she also sensed the next phase was near, something louder, more visible, and possibly dangerous. One evening, she came home to find a flash drive taped to her front door with a note that read, "For eyes that see beyond paperwork." She locked her doors, drew the blinds, and plugged the drive into her laptop. The files were encrypted but labeled in sequence. Malcolm, with his background in digital systems, helped decode them. Inside were video logs, short, shaky recordings made by Echo 4 members over the years. Each clip bore a date and location. The content varied. Testimony about failed missions, civilian casualties, rogue orders, internal conflicts. Danielle watched in silence, her heart tightening with each passing second. These weren't just war stories. They were confessions. And in each video, one phrase kept returning. The mission never ended. We went silent, not rogue. At the end of the last video, Joe appeared. His face was older, eyes tired but unbroken. "If this reaches her," he said into the lens, "then you found the last person who chose compassion over protocol. We were trained to protect, then ordered to forget. But forgetting is not healing. And she reminded us we were worth remembering. That was always the mission. If the storm comes again, she's the only one who will know how to stand." The video ended. It began when she noticed unfamiliar cars parked down her street. Not the usual worn-out sedans or neighborhood delivery vans, but government-grade SUVs, polished, still, with tinted windows and no license plates. The same day, she found her mailbox open. The content disturbed, nothing missing, but the sense of personal space violated. At work, she started seeing new patients with unlisted names and medical records flagged with classification codes she had never seen in civilian systems. And one evening, her computer froze mid-task and rebooted itself with no warning. When it restarted, the screen displayed a single line of text: "They're coming for the file." She immediately unplugged it, packed the hard drives she had been storing in Malcolm's office, and placed them in a fireproof lockbox. The storm Joe had warned of wasn't metaphorical anymore. It was a convergence, and Danielle stood at its eye. That night, she met with Elijah one last time. The retired intelligence officer had grown frilier in recent weeks, but his mind remained sharp. She showed him the footage, the messages, the sketch Joe left behind. Elijah studied everything carefully before leaning back and whispering, "You've crossed into legacy territory. This is the space where nations decide what stories live and which ones vanish." The echo files aren't just memories, they're proof. And proof, when it contradicts power, is dangerous. Danielle nodded slowly. "Then I need to protect them." Elijah nodded in return. "You need to share them, selectively, to people who still have honor, not just clearance." He handed her a small notebook, its cover worn and its pages filled with names, contacts, and references to people who could help. But he also warned her, "Some of the names in here will already be compromised. You must discern." She left Elijah's home in silence, knowing it would likely be the last time she saw him. The next morning, she received an email from a private, encrypted server. It read, "A directive has been issued. Your possession of classified data has triggered internal recovery protocol. Neutralize quietly. Do not leave a trail." There was no name, no origin, just a chilling message meant to intimidate. But Danielle wasn't afraid. She was alert. She immediately contacted the independent veterans group she had connected with weeks prior and arranged an emergency data drop in a secure public cloud, granting read-only access to a small group of trusted veterans. Then she sent a copy to a journalist she had once helped during a hospice case, someone she believed had the integrity to understand the weight of what she now held. Within 48 hours, the journalist contacted her. "Danielle," he said over a secure line, "you've just dropped a bomb on the intelligence community. These files don't just implicate bad actors. They rewrite entire missions, expose black operations, and reveal high-level cover-ups dating back 2 decades. Are you prepared for what comes next?" Danielle answered without hesitation, "I didn't start this, but I will finish it." The story broke 3 days later, a carefully redacted version that preserved identities while exposing the truth. The headline read, "The Echo Files, a legacy of hidden heroes and buried truth." Within hours, the media storm exploded. Military spokespeople issued vague denials. Online forums erupted with debate. Activists called for congressional investigations. Veterans began speaking out, emboldened by the revelation that their stories might finally be heard. But with the exposure came risk. Danielle received multiple threats, some subtle, some explicit. Her car was followed twice. Her clinic received anonymous complaints trying to discredit her. One night, someone attempted to break into her home, but fled when confronted by a neighborhood security drone. Malcolm insisted they relocate for safety. Danielle agreed, but not before sending encrypted backups of all files to multiple destinations across the country. She distributed hard copies to veteran families she trusted. The knowledge would not die with her. During this chaos, something extraordinary happened. The 12 Marines who had appeared at her wedding returned, not in uniform, but in presence. One by one, they arrived at her temporary residence, silently assuming watch. They rotated in shifts, coordinated without speaking, communicated through nods and hand signals. They never entered unless invited. They never questioned her actions. They were there not as soldiers of war, but as sentinels of memory. She came to know a few of them by name: Turner, Alvarez, King, but none volunteered their full stories. What mattered was their presence. They told her, without words, that she wasn't alone. One evening, as she reviewed legal documents sent by a pro bono legal team offering protection, she received a package. The veterans whose testimonies Danielle had protected were now emerging from shadow. Some spoke anonymously. Others stood in front of cameras, trembling but defiant. The stories they told painted a mosaic of operations lost to oversight and human dignity sacrificed in the name of strategy. The public was divided. Some hailed Danielle as a hero. Others questioned her credibility, accusing her of manipulating fragile minds or fabricating documents. She didn't engage. She let the evidence speak. And in the background, her protectors remained. Rotating sentinels in civilian clothes, Marines who moved like ghosts through cities, observing without interference. They never stayed long. They simply watched, nodded, and disappeared when the sun dipped low. Danielle began receiving invitations to speak. Universities, veteran coalitions, justice forums, all wanted her voice. She accepted selectively, choosing venues where she could preserve the integrity of the men she represented. She never accepted payment. Her only condition was that the names of the Echo Four remained honored, not exploited. On one such occasion, as she finished speaking to a quiet auditorium filled with military families, an elderly woman approached her. She wore a faded green jacket and held a photograph clutched tightly in her hand. "My son," she whispered. "He was an Echo. I didn't know until now. They told me he went rogue. But you gave me my boy back." Danielle held the woman's hands, nodded, and whispered, "He was never lost, just hidden. And now he's remembered." That same evening, Danielle was escorted to her car by a familiar face, Turner, one of the original 12. He walked beside her in silence until they reached the vehicle. Before she could unlock the door, he said, "There's movement. High level." Danielle tensed. "How high?" "Intelligence Committee. Defense Oversight. Some want the files buried. Others want accountability. And us. You're being watched. But no one's moving yet. You're protected. For now." Danielle nodded. The car door closed behind her. She drove home under a sky smeared with dusk, headlights stretching into the road like reaching hands. At home, Malcolm greeted her with quiet steadiness, arms wrapping around her like anchors. He had become more than support. He had become her tether. "They're starting to move," she said. He didn't ask who. He already knew. In the following days, legal notices began to arrive. Subpoenas, requests for testimony, quiet veiled threats masked as official queries. Her legal team worked nonstop, citing the protections of the Whistleblower Act, arguing that Danielle had done nothing illegal. She had simply uncovered the truth. But behind closed doors, shadow players began pushing. Political operatives tried to discredit the files. One televised panel declared them deeply edited and incomplete. But Danielle had anticipated that. She had preserved every original time-stamped and verified by third-party forensics long before release. Every accusation was countered with clarity. Every doubt met with documentation. Then came the digital assault. Hackers targeted her social media, attempted to breach her medical records, and flooded public forums with false narratives. But each attempt failed. Danielle had been prepared. Her digital defenses had been built with the help of those who once moved through cyber warfare like sculptors in code. One night, she received a video message sent through an encrypted server she hadn't touched since her first transfer of files. It showed a man in a dimly lit room, face obscured by shadow. He spoke in a voice deep and calm. "You are disrupting systems that have not seen daylight in 40 years. They will not go quietly, but you must continue. The public must see what was done in their name. Truth is not safe. It never has been, but it is necessary." The message ended with a code that unlocked a final sequence of echo recordings, files Joe had marked as fail-safe only. Danielle watched them alone. The recordings were more damning than anything released so far. They included direct audio of orders given by senior officials that contradicted public reports, along with visual footage of Echo for being instructed to abandon civilian outposts and erase records. It was undeniable, and it was also combustible. She debated releasing them. Doing so would ignite political chaos. But not doing so would make her complicit in the very silence she had been called to break. She prayed. She sat in the quiet of her apartment, the same one where she once packed Thursday meals for a homeless man she barely knew, and asked the same question she had asked herself in the beginning: what is right? The next morning, she released the files. Not through mainstream media, not through Congress, but directly to the public. An open archive, organized, verified, clean. Every file was accessible. Every name that could be protected was. Every voice preserved in its rawest form. The archive went viral within hours. Forum cached. Hashtags trended. Families came forward with matching stories. Retired officers began issuing private statements. Even some members of Congress expressed concern. The tide had shifted. The reckoning had begun. With the full weight of the Echo archive made public, Danielle knew retaliation would follow. But so would change. Investigations were launched. Oversight panels called emergency sessions. Military leaders issued denials, then apologies. The story spread beyond the borders of the United States, drawing attention from allies and critics alike. Joe Rankin's name trended globally. Not as a ghost, not as a victim, but as a man who had carried the truth in silence and passed it on to someone brave enough to speak. Danielle didn't seek attention. She avoided interviews. But in private, she wrote. Danielle Moore had always believed that some things in life were meant to be quiet, that grace lived in the small moments, that healing took root in silence, and that dignity did not always need to shout to be felt. But as she stood now before a crowded hall in Washington, D.C., preparing to speak before the newly formed Joint Committee on Veteran Legacy and Accountability, she understood that silence could also become a shield for lies, a cloak for injustice, and a grave for memory. The chairperson nodded to her, signaling it was time. Cameras rolled. Microphones clicked on. She stood not as a politician, not as an activist, but as a woman who had once packed home-cooked meals for a man everyone else passed by. Her voice steady, her eyes locked on the panel, she began. This didn't start as a mission. It started as a habit. A meal once a week for a man no one seemed to see. I didn't ask his name. I didn't know his history. I just knew he was hungry. And that was enough. The room listened in stillness, not out of courtesy, but reverence. She continued, her voice unwavering. But that man, Joe Rankin, he carried more than hunger. He carried history. A story the world forgot. A story someone tried to erase. And because I chose to see him, that story chose me. Her words traveled beyond the walls, broadcast to millions, translated into multiple languages, dissected by pundits, and shared in classrooms. But she spoke not for the world. She spoke for Joe, for Elijah, for the quiet guardians who had stood watch while the truth slept beneath layers of classified denial. She spoke for her father, whose service had been shadowed in secrecy, but whose values had lived on through her hands. And when her testimony ended, there was no applause, only silence, deep, sacred, and earned. Later that evening, as she walked alone through the National Mall, past monuments carved from stone and shadow, she felt a weight lift, not the burden of danger, but the burden of secrecy. She had done what she was meant to do. In the weeks that followed, real change began to take root. The Echo files sparked policy reform. New protocols were established to protect whistleblowers in classified units. Graves long listed as unmarked were corrected, names etched into marble, family members contacted and given truth instead of silence. Danielle received dozens of letters, handwritten and typed, from veterans, mothers, children of the forgotten. Some thanked her. Others simply said, "Now I know." She never responded publicly. She carried their words like prayers. She returned to the hospice, resumed her work, her routines, her Thursday meals. But now, when she delivered food to the corners of her city, she did so not in anonymity, but in quiet defiance of apathy. She saw the unseen. She remembered the forgotten. One day, while walking her old route, she noticed a new bench had been installed at Joe's corner. Upon its surface was engraved a simple phrase, "To those who saw beyond the silence." And beneath it, smaller, the names of Echo 4, hers included. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in tones of fire and gold, Danielle sat on the bench and closed her eyes. A gentle breeze passed through the streets. Somewhere nearby, a young man placed a tray of food next to a sleeping figure. She smiled. The torch had already passed again. The legacy lived on, not in headlines or awards, but in action, in compassion, in memory. She reached into her coat pocket and removed the last letter Joe had written her, folded and worn from being carried everywhere she went. She didn't need to read it. She had memorized every word. She whispered its final line into the wind. You reminded us who we were before we forgot. As she sat in that sacred silence, she realized the truth Joe had tried to teach her all along. Heroism doesn't arrive with fanfare. It appears in ordinary people who choose to do the right thing when no one is watching. And the most powerful legacies are not those shouted from podiums, but those passed quietly, through hands that feed, hearts that hold, and voices that remember. The end. If you've been moved by this story and want to see more like it, make sure to like and subscribe. It helps more than you know. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the plot. What did you expect? What caught you off guard? And which moment hit the hardest? Let me know where you're watching from too. Drop your thoughts in the comments and let's talk about it. Your feedback shapes what comes next.